As you will hear throughout the day, one of the conference themes is inspiring hope. We have the perfect speaker to address that powerful message, Dr. David B. Feldman, professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. His topic, how hope is often misunderstood and why it's important. Considered one of the nation's foremost researchers in his field, David's writings have addressed such topics as hope, meaning, and growth in the face of highly stressful circumstances. The inspiration for his work comes from his most important teachers, the many individuals with trauma and serious illness he has seen experience growth and embrace their lives despite significant adversity. He's also authored 3 books, has been published in numerous scientific journals, writes regularly for Psychology Today, and hosts About Health on KPFA Radio. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David B. Feldman.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by just sharing a bit of a story to ground us. Dr. Tamika had been an oncologist for 20 years, but sitting in her office looking at the PET scans of one of her newest patients named Melanie, she realized that during that time, her job hadn't gotten any easier. The thing that she struggled with the most wasn't the technical aspects of being an oncologist. It was the more human aspects. It was particularly knowing the right words to say to patients, particularly when giving them really hard news. And that's exactly what she knew she was going to need to do for Melanie. You see, she could see from the PET scans that even though Melanie's prostate cancer was newly diagnosed, pancreatic cancer was newly diagnosed, it was already very advanced. Now, Melanie, for her part, was young. She was only 48 years old. She had made her way to Boston about 20 years ago, and using her tenacity and her intelligence, had quickly worked her way up the chain to eventually making partner at a very prestigious civil engineering firm. Dr. Tamika knew that Melanie was going to need all of that tenacity and all of that intelligence now to be able to face her cancer diagnosis. You see, Dr. Tamika was caught in a kind of bind. Part of her wanted to go into that room with Melanie and just give the cold, hard facts. Say something like, I'm really sorry, but we caught your cancer too late. And you've only got a really tiny chance of surviving for longer than a year, even with the best available treatment. But as truthful as that felt, and it did feel truthful to her, it also felt really cruel. After all, wouldn't she be destroying Melanie's hope? So the other part of Dr. Tamika wanted to take a really different tack. She wanted to go into the room with Melanie and say something like, look on the bright side, it's not so bad, everything will be okay. And while that may have felt a little bit emotionally better to Dr. Tamika, it also felt really dishonest, like she would be hiding most of the facts. Well, this bind that she found herself in actually has a name. Sometimes it's called the double bind of cancer care. And it's not unique to Dr. Tamika. It's not unique to Melanie. It's something that oncologists face all the time. And perhaps if you have had your own cancer diagnosis or you've loved someone who has, you've faced some version of this, where on the one hand, you wanted to be really honest with yourself and know all the facts. And on the other hand, you wanted to do everything possible to maintain your hope. Well, one of the things I want to try to get across today is that this bind is really a false bind. It's a false bind because it's based on a false premise, or at least a premise that is mostly false. And that's the idea that hope and reality are somehow opposites. That where hope exists, reality cannot, and where reality exists, hope cannot. And I think that this story communicates a kind of fundamental myth or misunderstanding about what hope is, actually a couple of myths or misunderstandings. And that's actually where I want to start, by addressing some common misunderstandings about hope that, although they're nobody's fault, can actually cause problems for some people. And then I want to talk about what I think hope is and why I think it's important in general, but particularly when people are facing cancer. Now, the first misunderstanding, if you will, or myth about hope is something that I think is endemic to the healthcare system. It's absolutely everywhere. And that's the idea that hope equals cure. Now, I certainly don't think that this is true. And only a minute's thought will show you that although it can be true, and sometimes it's true, it's really a very incomplete definition of hope. After all, think about your lives. Think about your lives up until now. My bet is that you've hoped for lots of things in your life, that you've had hopes for your family, for your friends, for your relationships, for your kids, for your job, right? For traveling. Who knows, right? But hope is a lot larger than the idea of cure. But something happens when people are diagnosed with a serious illness like cancer, and they enter the medical system, and suddenly everybody, often most prominently physicians, start using cure as if it's a synonym for hope. Now, don't get me wrong. Hoping for a cure is great, and it's super important for many, many people. And hope burns brightly. Hope for cure, rather, burns brightly for lots of people. In fact, the latest statistics that I looked at show that with advancements in cancer care over the last 20 years, something like 65% or more of malignancies are, in fact, curable or at least survivable for a matter of many years. And of course, it differs by type of cancer, with some cancers like breast cancer having much higher survival rates. But nonetheless, the problem with equating hope with cure is, what about the other 35% of people? The 35% of people, say, for whom the cures, or for whom the treatments don't work so well, for whom survival or cure isn't in the cards. Are we really saying that hope is not for them, that somehow hope is off limits? Well, I'm not comfortable saying that about any group of people. And besides, as I already said, people have hopes for lots of things in their lives. So hope is a lot broader than cure. And regardless of whether someone's in the 65% or the 35%, I think it's important that we all attend to all of the different sources of hope in our lives, not just one. So I don't see hope as equivalent to cure. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. The second, I think, misunderstanding or myth is that somehow hope equals optimism. Now, optimism and hope are sister terms, sister concepts, but I certainly don't think that they're the same thing. So let me just start with optimism. What exactly is optimism? Well, one way of thinking about optimism is that it's the belief that the future is just going to be bright, that everything's going to work out well, that things are just going to keep getting better and better. And I don't think that's the same as hope. Now, we use lots of metaphors to describe optimists, right? We say that, for instance, they see the world through rose-colored glasses. And what is that saying? It's saying that they sort of see reality as being better than it really is. That's what rose-colored glasses means. Or we say that they see the glass as half full, sometimes with cherry soda in it. There's a way in which, in order to maintain optimism, particularly in the face of problems and obstacles in life, one of which, of course, is cancer, there's a way in which you have to kind of paint a smiley face over the reality and act like it's not happening, or at least that it's not as bad or as hard as it really is. Now, if you can maintain that kind of positive thinking, great. Good for you. I'm not knocking it. But a lot of people have told me they just find it really hard to maintain that kind of positive thinking. It's not natural to them. And so if that's you, the good news is that I don't think optimism and hope are the same thing. So exactly how are they different? Well, to communicate that, I want to tell you about the story of a particular person. This is Alan Locke. Now, Alan Locke is not a cancer survivor, but he is the survivor of another serious disease, health condition that would change his life forever. I met Alan when we were writing our third book, my co-author Lee Daniel Kravitz and I, called Super Survivors, where we talked to people who had survived terrible traumas and tragedies. Alan's story begins when he's a little boy, a little British kid living in the UK. He had always dreamed of being in the British Royal Navy. And so he busted his behind to do well in school. And finally, when he was 25 years old, he achieved that dream and he was serving aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic. And late one night, it was like 1 a.m, he was trying to read some navigational charts and he realized that his eyes were very blurry. So he kind of rubbed them and he looked again and his eyes were still blurry. And he thought to himself, I'm probably just sleepy. It's 1 a.m. I'll get a good night's sleep. In the morning, it'll all be better. Only it wasn't. His eyes were even blurrier. So he ended up going to the doctor, and the doctor, after a thorough exam, gave him news that no 25-year-old should have to hear. He was diagnosed with an eye disease that he was told would eventually take his vision, called macular degeneration. It's a disease that often people are diagnosed with in their 60s, 70s, or 80s. And he was told that most likely he would lose most of his useful vision and, in fact, become legally blind. He was also told that there was no treatment that would really stop it for him. Now, his friends told him, look on the bright side, put your mind on the positive, don't think any negative thoughts, be optimistic. And Alan tried to do that. He tried to tell himself, you know what? Maybe my doctor is wrong. Maybe my macular degeneration will reverse itself. Maybe I won't lose my dream job in the Royal Navy. But try as he might to think optimistically, reality just kind of happened. And eventually he did lose his vision and he did lose that dream job. And he flew into a deep depression. I mean, who could blame him? And he told us that the more he tried to think optimistically, actually, the deeper his depression got. And he also told us that the more he tried to think optimistically, the more it just felt like he was lying to himself and the people he loved. He felt like he was sort of self-alienated. And so he told us that he wasn't able to move forward until he actually gave up optimistic thinking and embraced what he called realistic thinking. It wasn't until he was able to tell himself and admit to himself that, yes, he had lost his vision and he wasn't getting it back. Doctor after doctor had told him that. It wasn't until he was able to tell himself that he had lost his job and he wasn't getting it back. Advisor after advisor had told him that. It wasn't until he admitted these things to himself and really looked reality squarely in the face that he was able to grieve his losses. And don't get me wrong, there's no way around that. He had a lot of grieving to do. But only then could he step back and ask himself an incredibly hopeful and forward-looking question. And that question was, what now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of the reality that I'm facing? And he said only then did he feel freed to begin to put one step in front of the other to move towards what hopefully was a better future. Now, I won't belabor the rest of his story, but I want to fast forward to the present. He becomes the first legally blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic. Here he is after getting to Barbados, looking tired but happy. And now he holds a place in the coveted Guinness Book of World Records. He also becomes the first legally blind person to trek across Antarctica. And he has become an inspiration to millions of blind and low-sighted people across the globe. And again, when we asked him, how did you do that? He said it wasn't through optimism, it was through realistic thinking. Now, if we step back and we look at his story for a minute, we'll see that it was more than just realistic thinking. It was also hopeful thinking, right? Because he asked himself that incredibly hopeful question, what can I do now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of the reality that I face? And so I think one of the lessons of Alan's story is that real hope is grounded in reality. Real hope is grounded in reality. Real hope you could call grounded hope. Now, I think that's one of the major differences between optimism and hope. And I'm not the first person to suggest that. And neither is Alan Locke. In fact, it kind of goes back 30 plus years to this person right here. This is the great C.R. Snyder, one of the founders of the field of positive psychology. C.R. Snyder, or as his friends called him, Rick, was a really good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, and sadly passed away about 20 years ago. And Rick spent his whole life trying to understand what hope means and how it works for people and how to help people to lead a hopeful life, a meaningful life, despite real problems and obstacles. Rick really wanted to understand hope, but he knew that simply going to people and asking, what does hope mean to you, was a dead end, because he knew that as multifaceted as hope is, everyone's likely to give a different answer. So he didn't do that. Instead, he took a year-long sabbatical from his job at the University of Kansas as a professor, and he did what amounted to a very grassroots research study. He approached leaders in his community. These were business leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, educational leaders. And he asked them to name all of the most hopeful people they knew, using whatever definition of hope they wanted. He didn't ask them for their definition of hope, again, because he knew that that was a dead end. Just using whatever definition they wanted, he asked them to list out all the most hopeful people they knew. He also asked them the opposite. Can you name some, shall we say, less hopeful people? And then he took all these names, and over the next year, he interviewed every single person he could on that list. And he asked them simply, tell me how you think. So he was interested in finding out what was common in the way that all of these very hopeful people thought about life and the world. And what he found out was that they all shared three things in common that he called the three components of hope. But I actually think a more intuitive way of thinking about them is as the three conditions for hope to thrive. Because it turns out that everybody in that very hopeful list had these three conditions set in their lives. And so I want to tell you about these three conditions, but before I do, I want to give you the warning that they're not rocket science. In fact, they're pretty simple, and I think that's one of the powers of this version of thinking about hope, is that it's very pragmatic, it's very practical. But I have to say, as a psychologist, one of the things that I've noticed, and also in my own life, is that it's very often the simple things that we know we should do that we don't do in our lives. And I think we can count these three conditions for hope to thrive among those sometimes. So the first of these conditions is this one: goals, having something to hope for. So this is kind of no duh, right? In order for hope to thrive, you got to have something to hope for. Now, if you think about throughout your life, chances are you have many goals, and you have even many goals on a daily basis. But I also bet that for most of you, most of your daily goals are goals that you have to do. They're goals that you have to do for other people, your boss, your kids, your spouse, to make money. And look, there's nothing wrong with those kinds of goals. There's nothing wrong with having responsibilities and meeting them. That's what makes the world go round. But I think for setting this first condition for hope to thrive, it's really important to have at least one goal that is truly intrinsically meaningful to you. One goal that's just for you. So I want to challenge you and invite you to think about your lives right now. And if you don't have one of those goals, think about setting one. Even a small one can be powerfully important in setting this first condition for hope to thrive. The second condition is known as pathways. Pathways, a pathway is just a fancy word for a plan or a strategy, some way for getting to your goal. Now, if you've ever been in a position where you felt like you didn't have a way that you could ever imagine would get you to a goal that was important to you, you probably felt pretty hopeless. And that's why it's super important to really try to nurture our pathways. Now, I'm not pretending this is easy. I said that these conditions are simple, but they're not always easy because very often in our lives, we can see that the pathways that we've planned and we've plotted out really carefully can be blocked. Obstacles can get in our way. And I don't know any magical way to deal with that other than to sit down, be really honest with what's standing in our way. Sometimes I get out a piece of paper and I try to brainstorm what are some steps I can take to get just a little closer to my goal, to try to start to get around whatever's blocking my path, because we know that doing something, anything to move just a little bit further along on our pathways can be a powerful way of planting that second condition for hope to thrive. And the third condition is agency. Agency is kind of a funky word, but really what it means is motivation or energy, the motivation and energy we need to pursue our goals. Now, agency can come from many sources. For many people, but not for all, it comes from our physical bodies, our physical selves. So eating a diet that's healthy, exercising, for instance, getting enough sleep. The point with exercise, for instance, is to make sure that we're exercising within what our body can do, right? Because very often our body, particularly in instances of things like chronic pain, can't do a ton of exercise, but figuring out how to do that in a way that's compatible with our body. So the physical self can be a source of agency, but often for people with serious or chronic illnesses like cancer, the physical body is not a great source of agency. So luckily, there are other sources. For some people, again, not all, spirituality, religion can be a major source of agency or energy or motivation. Hearing an amazing sermon, prayer, meditation, seeing a beautiful cathedral, hearing an amazing, inspiring piece of music can be ways of buoying up our agency. But another important way is our relationships. This is, I think, a really important one for me. I think about my own life, and when I'm low in agency, I often go to those people in my life that are cheerleaders. You know what I mean? Those people who believe in me more than I do even. And often they can lend me a little bit of their agency. So these are the three conditions for hope to thrive. Not rocket science, but really important because we know now from 30 years of research, going way beyond that first study in 1991, hundreds of studies now show that when we have these three conditions set in our lives, we not only feel more hopeful, but we also have lots of other positive outcomes in our lives. So this is the part of the presentation where I go through 30 years of research in 3 minutes. We'll see if I can do it. I promise I won't belabor this, but I kind of want to share with you what we know from the science on hope. Now, some of these studies have been done in people with serious illness conditions, among them cancer. But many of these studies have also been done with people without such conditions, people who you could call physically healthy. Adults, kids, teenagers, older adults, etc. So I want to start by giving you kind of a grand tour. Then I promise I'll zoom in on what we know about hope and cancer. So we know that people who have these three conditions set in their lives in a habitual way, who I'm going to call high hope people, these folks tend to accomplish their goals more readily than low hope people. That is, people who are missing one or more of these conditions to thrive in a habitual way in their lives. And we know that because we've done longitudinal studies where we can measure people's hope and then follow up with them months later. We also know that people who have high hope, that is, people who have these conditions habitually set in their lives, tend to eat a healthier diet, lower in salt and fat, higher in fruits and vegetables. They also tend to exercise more regularly. And just like I said before, very importantly, when things get in their way of exercising, like, for instance, chronic pain, which is very hard to deal with, and I'll talk a little bit more later, they're able to step back and find, shall we say, alternative pathways around that blockage, ways of exercising that are compatible with their bodies. And that's really important. People with higher hope also report that they feel a greater sense that their life is filled with purpose and meaning. People with lower hope, that is, people who habitually don't have these three conditions for hope to thrive, often report feeling depressed. And we also know that when we're through intervention, when we're able to help them set those three conditions for hope to thrive, even a little, we're able to help alleviate depression. And that's super important. We know that there's a connection between hope and pain, an inverse connection. You may know that chronic pain is one of the most common conditions in the world and in this country, that something like 80% of us at some point during our lives will have a chronic pain condition. And it's really hard to live with chronic pain. I can say that out of some personal experience. Now, we've done research on hope and chronic pain with a variety of different groups, including adolescents who have survived really serious burns, including adults who have had injury-producing accidents, including people who are paralyzed, often from the neck or the waist down. So, in other words, people who are quadriplegic or paraplegic and have phantom limb pain. Just really hard stuff. And what we know is that people who go into these chronic pain conditions, having set these conditions for hope to thrive in their lives, those folks somehow seem to be able to face or deal with or cope with that chronic pain a little better than the people who are lower in hope. The pain seems not to stop them quite as much. They seem to have a greater sense of mental health and of well-being, even in spite of that pain. And I think that's a really big deal, considering, how hard chronic pain can be. And then finally, we know that there's a connection between these conditions for hope to thrive, that is hope, and post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth happens sometimes for people who have experienced serious trauma and tragedy. So after a period of emotional turmoil, which is inevitable following trauma and tragedy, pain is not something you can skip over. After that period, a certain percentage of people, it's about 60 to 70%, say that they grow in some way. That may be seeing the sky as blue or the grass as greener. It may be appreciating each day more or being more mindful of the present moment. For some people, it's growing or deepening in their spirituality. For others, it's deepening in their relationships. And for these folks who grow, they often say it's one of the most important things they think they've ever done. We know that hope is related to that people who have these conditions set in their lives tend to experience more of this growth than people who are missing one or more of these. So lots of reasons to think that hope is related to positive outcomes, things that we care about in life. But most of this research was done, as I mentioned, in folks that don't necessarily have cancer. So I want to tell you about one very new study, hot off the press, that we just published, we just finished, that looks at hope in cancer. In fact, hope in very, very serious cancer. This was a study of 500 people, actually 500 plus people with advanced cancers. Now, all of these folks had metastatic cancer. In fact, all of these folks had a note in their electronic medical record that a doctor had written at some point saying that they were expected to live for only a year, maybe two. So really serious cancers. And by the way, these folks knew that. They knew that they had, more than life-threatening cancers, that they had life-limiting cancers that were likely to take their lives. And all of the people in this study had also elected to enter palliative care. Now, what we did was we followed them for 4 years. And at the very beginning of this 4 years, the very start of the study, we asked them some questions to assess their level of hope, just general hope. And then we followed them And as sad as it is to say, we followed them to see who would pass away and who wouldn't and when. And here's what we found. This is a graph, and along the bottom, you see the number of months. So you can see that the study was 50 months long, so about 4 years. And along the left, you see cumulative survival. So again, as sad as this is to say, this is the percentage of people who actually were still alive at each point in the study. And I'm going to draw you 2 lines. The green line are people who started the study generally feeling hopeful. And the blue line are people who started the study feeling not so hopeful. And as you can see that over 50 months, pretty much at every point in the study, with one exception at the end, the people who were high in hope were more likely to be alive. Now, for those of you who really care about the stats, this is, of course, a statistically significant difference. And another thing that you should know is that we were able to statistically control for a number of factors having to do with disease severity. So in other words, hope is predicting survival above and beyond the initial severity of the cancer. So I think this is a really stunning finding. And it really shows us that hope is important. And even though this is a finding in people with very advanced metastatic disease, I believe that hope is equally important at any stage of cancer, even much earlier in the cancer journey. So I think all of this leads me to the following profound insight. Actually, before I get there, you may be curious about what the actual months were. Here you can actually see that the green line, those who started the study with high hope, lived a median of about 16 months. People on the blue line lived a median of about 9 months. So a pretty stunning difference. All right, so now the profound insight. And this is the same insight that I shared with you about 4 years ago when I gave a talk at this conference. And that is that hope is good. As if you needed me to tell you that, right? I call it a profound insight, but of course, all of you probably already knew that. Hopefully this presentation is just giving you reasons to believe that more. Now, I hope that I've also gotten across so far that hope isn't necessarily the same as optimism, that it doesn't require you to wear rose-colored glasses to paint a smiley face over the realities that you might be facing in your life. I also hope that I've gotten across, or at least started to get across, that hope isn't the same as cure, that it's perfectly legit to hope for a cure, of course, but hope is broader. We have hopes for many important, meaningful things in our lives. Now, even thinking about that study that I just told you about, of those 500 individuals with advanced cancer, remember that they had metastatic disease, that they had life-limiting cancers. They knew it. Most of them knew that cure, at least long-term cure, was probably not in the cards for them. So if they weren't hoping for a cure, what were they hoping for? Well, I don't know. I don't know because we didn't ask people in that particular study. But there was another study that we did several years before of a different group of people. These were about 100 people in hospice care. So people with very advanced cancers, people who you could say had terminal illness. And my amazing research assistants and myself were invited to enter these folks' homes. And we had really intimate, and I found them moving, conversations with these individuals. And we asked them, what are you hoping for in your lives now? And they told us many things. And I want to share with you some of those things because maybe you'll find them as impressive and moving as I did. We heard a lot of people say things like, to resume my hobby of digital photography, basically saying, I want to engage with things, with activities that are meaningful to me. Many people say that they at some point in their life had put those meaningful things on hold, and now they want to make sure to get back to them. So people said, I want to do things that I have always dreamed of doing. I remember one guy who had been in electronics his whole life. And he showed me this beautiful 1920s tube radio, a beautiful Art Deco wood box. And he told me that he really wanted to repair it. It was broken. He really wanted to fix it so he could pass it on to his grandkids. So lots of people saying, I want to engage in meaningful activities. We also heard people say that they wanted to engage in meaningful experiences. Somebody told us that she wanted to take a helicopter ride. We heard people say, I want to go to the beach. I want to travel. I want to go to a particular place. I remember one particular guy said that he always wanted to drive a Lamborghini. Go figure. And so he was actually in hospice, and the hospice care team actually arranged to have a Lamborghini dealership deliver a Lamborghini to his doorstep. And they helped him to hoist his oxygen tank into the passenger seat, and he zoomed around his neighborhood probably faster than any of us would feel comfortable with. But what an amazing story. So really engaging in meaningful activities. We heard people say a lot of things like, I want to do some writing about my life. I want to write my memoirs. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. People said they wanted to spend time with their grandkids, with their loved ones, with their friends and family, right? These are goals that many of us have in our lives all the time. And we shouldn't be surprised that these kinds of goals or hopes are important. We heard people say things like, I want to pass on what I have to the world, and I want to enjoy the rest of my days, no matter how long that is, long, short, anything. So these are some of the things that we heard. And to me, this proves that hope is a really broad concept. That yes, it can include hope for cure, but it also includes all of the multifaceted hopes and dreams and aspirations and goals that we have in our lives. And I think it also shows us that hope can exist for anyone, even in folks that are in pretty dire situations, even in folks that are in situations that maybe superficially people from the outside might say seem hopeless. Now, all of this reminds me of one particular patient who I want to tell you about. This is somebody I met when I was working in inpatient hospice. And I will warn you that it's actually a really hard story. It's a hard story because he passes away in the end. But I'm not telling it to depress you. Quite the opposite. I'm telling you because this gentleman illustrates, I think, hope more than anyone I've ever met in my life, particularly the importance of hope, even in really, really hard situations. I'll call him Ned. And I first met Ned, like I said, when I was working in inpatient hospice. He had cancer. It doesn't really matter what the details of the cancer is for this story, but suffice it to say it was metastatic, that he and his doctor had tried many, many treatments, that they hadn't worked well. And eventually he and his doctor had a very open conversation, and they had decided together that hospice care was his best option. So I met him when he first was checked into his room. And the first thing I was struck with was his tremendous sense of humor. Big smile. He loved to tell jokes to anybody who would listen. And these jokes, by the way, they weren't an avoidance tactic. He just loved humor. And I once asked Ned, how many jokes do you know? And he told me, big grin, I know 1,000 of them or more. And those don't count the dirty ones. And he chuckled. And that gives you a sense of this guy's sense of humor. But one day, about a week later, a nurse entered his room and Ned had been crying. And she, of course, asked, what's going on? And he looked up at her, tears in his eyes, and said, my grandkids will never hear my jokes. And he told me a little bit later that his grown children don't really have a sense of humor, but his grandkids do. But many of them are too young to appreciate his jokes, particularly the dirty ones. And so he said he felt really hopeless, more hopeless than he had felt in a long time, but really about this important dream or goal of making sure his jokes live beyond him. And so the hospice care team we decided, with his permission, to buy him a notebook. Actually, we bought him this beautiful leather-bound journal and a really fancy pen, and he loved it. And he began to write down all the jokes and make a book of jokes. And within a week, he filled the pages of that journal. So we got him a second journal. And about a week later, he was about halfway through that when he started to get weaker and his hands started to shake. And it was hard for him to write. And so the hospice staff, including myself, took turns sitting by his bedside, taking dictation. And we filled most of that second book. And then Ned came to us with an idea. And I'll admit, I got a little scared. I was like, any idea Ned comes up with scares me. But it was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful idea. He said, I want to put on a stand-up comedy show. And we agreed wholeheartedly, or as he calls it, a lay-down comedy show, because he couldn't get up out of bed. And again, that shows you his wicked sense of humor. So we set a date 3 days into the future. And during those days, he prepared. In fact, he made a set list, and we could hear him rehearsing in his room day in and day out. And finally, the moment arrived, and he was wheeled out into the hallway. Other patients from the unit joined us. Staff joined us, including myself. And for 15 minutes, we laughed and we laughed and we laughed. And I remember looking at Ned's face and seeing it beam with hope. In a situation, again, that other people from the outside might superficially say seems hopeless. But think about it. At that moment, and in the days and weeks leading up to it, didn't Ned have the 3 conditions for hope to thrive set in his life? He had a goal that was important to him, to pass on his jokes. He had pathways that he was pretty sure would work, to tell his jokes, to have a stand-up comedy routine, to write down his jokes, to give dictation. And he had agency that came from his own enthusiasm, but also from the support of a team behind him. So this really proves to me how important all those other hopes are in people's lives, no matter where they are in the cancer journey. And that hope can exist in lots of different, even really hard situations. Now, whether or not you can imagine yourself in Ned's situation, I think all of us, by this point in history, can imagine ourselves being in what seems like a hopeless situation. I'm referring to the last 3 years, and I'm referring to COVID, right? This virus that took so many lives. I know I lost people early in the pandemic that I loved dearly, that showed us what it was like to be isolated, to be lonely, to be afraid. It's been awful. Not to mention all of the other things that our world and our country have faced: political unrest and discord, social injustice, ongoing racism, including violence that we've seen in our communities. And of course, war in Ukraine is added to the list. It's easy to become hopeless in these kinds of situations. And in fact, I really worry that people have. One of the things that people tell me often, because of course they know I'm the hope guy, is that they feel hopeless. People have told me that they've given up hope that the world could ever be any better. I worry a lot about that, because if you think about the definition of hope I've given you, right? Goals, pathways, and agency, isn't that the engine that drives progress? Aren't these the things which push us forward to try to achieve our goals, to try to make our lives better and even the world better? So what I worry about when people say that they've given up on these things, I worry about what that means for us and for our communities and for our world. So as I get to the conclusion of this study, I really want to challenge you all to nurture your hope, to not be afraid to hope, no matter what you're facing in your lives. And I also want to give you a beautiful quote by, I think, the inspiring essayist and activist Rebecca Solnit. Now, she was writing about politics when she made this quote, but actually I think this quote is good for any area of our lives. She writes, your opponents, no matter whom or what they are, your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win. But hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to give away. I think this is a beautiful quote. And I think and hope that it shows us that hope can exist even when things seem really hard. Now, believe it or not, Dr. Tamika knew these words, and she thought about this quote as she was contemplating what to say to Melanie. Dr. Tamika had been in practice for long enough to know that hope and realism were not opposites, and she vowed to herself that she would nurture both in the conversation she was about to have with Melanie. So when she entered the room, she started the conversation by saying to Melanie, I have to level with you. Your cancer is really far along. It's going to be really hard to treat, but I also promise you that I will never abandon you. I will be there every step of the way to help you make the best decisions for yourself and your life that you can. But before we talk about that, what is it that you want for your life? Now, Melanie says that just hearing those words was an enormous relief. You see, Melanie wasn't stupid. She knew she had cancer. And given how long she had had the symptoms for, she was pretty sure it was pretty far advanced. So upon hearing these words, she thought for a second, she sighed. She looked at Dr. Tamika square in the face, and she said, I want to fight this thing. I want to fight this thing, but I also want to make sure that whatever treatments we choose leaves plenty of space in my life to begin to check off the boxes on my bucket list, because there's a lot that I want to do. At that moment, Melanie had hope. It wasn't a hope that came from a kind of naive optimism. It wasn't a hope that came from seeing the glass as half full or seeing the world through rose-colored glasses or painting a smiley face over the reality of her situation. It wasn't a hope that came from believing the cure would be easy. She knew that it wouldn't. She knew that it wouldn't. So I'm not pretending that hope is a panacea. Nothing in this presentation, I hope, has gotten across in any way that hope is a magical cure-all for everything. I'm pretty sure there's nothing in life that is. But Melanie's hope was based in something more solid than any of this. It was based in goals that she cared about, in having pathways that she believed might get her there, and in having agency, part of which came from a relationship with a physician that really cared about her. In life's uncertainties, sometimes that's the best any of us could ever ask for. Thank you. Now, I hope that's been a useful presentation with useful information. I'm aware that Erica Bell is watching the chat. She's part of the BACC staff, and she can field questions. So I think we have a few minutes. I'm pretty sure I went a little over the 40-minute limit, but hopefully we have a few minutes, Erica, to take questions, and I'm really all ears.
We sure do have a few minutes, so I encourage the audience members to type their questions into the box. I will get them that way. Thank you so much, Dr. Feldman, for really hopeful and inspiring and realistic, moving talk. I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience members did as well. I did receive a couple of questions during the talk. I know you, through the stories you told, gave some examples of small goals that some of the people you interviewed or worked with had made. But can you give some other examples or maybe some insights onto how people might set small goals?
Sure. Sure. Let me give you one more story, one more example, and then I'll maybe give you some ideas about how to set them in your own lives. So I remember early in the pandemic, which wasn't that long ago, I was talking to a friend of mine And she was saying that she felt really hopeless and helpless. And those often go hand in hand. Being isolated at home and feeling like there was nothing that she could do, particularly in the face of the pandemic. This was in kind of mid to late 2020. And so I just asked her, I said, well, I'm a hope person, and I know that there's probably no big way that you can suddenly change the world, but is there a small thing you can do? Anything that maybe uses your skills and abilities. So that's one hint. Like, what are the things you're good at? What are the things that you enjoy that would make maybe even a little difference? Like I said, you can do something, anything that moves you towards making the world a little bit better place, or your life a little bit better. And she thought about it for a second, and she was a quilter. She was a master quilter. She made these amazing quilts. So she decided that she would use her skills to make some beautiful quilted, actually, face masks for people. Remember, this was at a time when the CDC had just announced that masks were recommended, and there was a shortage of masks. So she made actually dozens of masks, the first of which she gave to her friends to make sure that they were safe. But then she gave lots of them to different charity organizations and nonprofits that were distributing masks to people who maybe couldn't access them or couldn't afford them. And, it's funny, these masks were really cool. She made me a Star Wars mask with like different patches of Star Wars fabrics, because I'm a Star Wars nut. They were really cool. And when I checked in with her maybe a month later, she said it made an enormous difference, that she suddenly felt hopeful, that if she and others could do this kind of thing, maybe there was hope for our world. And so, I always tell people, think about the things in your life that you can do, even little things that use your talents, that use your skills. I also ask people to think about goals, hopes that they've had in the past, even when they were young, that really gave them a great sense of meaning. And, could you re-engage with those? Or does that give you clues about the kinds of things that you could do in your life now? I also ask people to think about their values. What is it that you value in others? What is it that you value in the world? And, what is that? Is that physical fitness? Is that caring for others? Is that art? Is it beauty? And then does that give you any clues about some goals, some hopes, even small ones that you could set in your own life? If it's beauty, if it's art, maybe start to learn how to draw. If it's physical fitness, maybe exercise a little within your means. These kinds of things. Does that help a little, Erica?
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. We have 1 minute remaining, and I'm going to try to sneak in one last important question. You mentioned agency is important in people having high hope. And what are some ways we can help people increase their agency, especially people who have historically been marginalized and robbed of agency through our system?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's probably bigger than I can say in a minute. So let me kind of give you a preview of the answer, and it will be incomplete. I mentioned that one of the things that we've seen over the past 3 years, and it's not new, it's ongoing, is we've seen the reality of racism, of marginalization, and of oppression in our society. And I will admit to you, I have lots of privilege. I'm a white guy, but I'm also part of a marginalized group. I'm gay. And I grew up a little gay kid in the Midwest in the 80s and 90s when I got lots of messages about being less than. And that's a challenge to agency. I don't have a magical cure for this. But what I would say to people is, it is that quote from Rebecca Solnit, that the enemy really has won. The system really has won. The racists, the forces that put you in a marginalized position really have won if you let them rob you of your hope. And so the first thing that I would say is, it's a hard journey. Find people that love you, that support you, that give you a sense of empowerment, but don't let the enemies of marginalization, of oppression win. Try to not be afraid to hope. That's my urging, as hard as that is to do. And I urge people to ask more if people want to reach out to me, because I'd love to continue that conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. And for our audience, we're now going to transition to our survivor stories from Sandra and Shay.